Hello and welcome to Guidance Review. I'm David Pudwill, and today we're going to be talking about FDA's recent guidance document, which was published in August of 2020, titled Principles for Selecting, Developing, Modifying, and Adapting Patient-Reported Outcome Instruments for Use in Medical Device Evaluation. So if we go ahead and open that up, we can pull that up right here. And here we can see, if we scroll down, that this is a draft guidance document. It's not for implementation, contains non-binding recommendations, and this guidance is being distributed for comment purposes only. We can see that we need to submit comments by 10/30/2020, and we can go to the docket to regulations.gov here. That'll take us to the Federal Register notice. And a copy of the guidance document can be accessed here as well. At the time of this recording, there are 0 comments received. So there's not much else to really see here at the moment. But if we go back and scroll up, this is where we can download the draft guidance document, this button here. And I've already done that, and I can pull up that draft guidance document. Here, again, it contains non-binding recommendations. It's draft, not for implementation. And we can see that there's some more information here directing you back to regulations.gov. And for questions about the document, you can contact Michelle Tarver at the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation, or email cdrhpro at fda.hhs.gov, this email address here. And we can see that this is a joint guidance document for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health and the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. And if we scroll down, again, additional copies, sort of normal front matter material here. You can see the draft watermark in the background on this guidance document. And we get into the table of contents. We see an introduction, scope, general considerations, best practices, a summary, and a glossary. And we can see here, because this is a draft guidance, you see numbering for each of the lines. Makes it easier to comment, provide feedback if you're looking to. And there's an interesting introduction here that I'll go ahead and read. It says, the FDA encourages the collection, analysis, and integration of patient perspectives in the development, evaluation, and surveillance of medical devices. Patients' perspectives on living with their health condition and its treatment or management are most useful in medical device evaluation when they are relevant to the regulatory decision and reliably measured. Patient-reported outcome, or PRO, instruments facilitate the systematic collection of how patients feel, function, and survive as valid scientific evidence to support the regulatory and healthcare decision-making process. By integrating patients' voices throughout the total product life cycle, concepts important to patients can be considered in the evaluation and surveillance of medical devices. PRO instruments allow for collection of certain data as valid scientific evidence of safety and/or effectiveness, which is complementary to other evidence of clinical outcomes and/or biomarkers. Use of PRO instruments is generally voluntary but may be specifically recommended in certain standards and guidances. PRO instruments can include patient diaries, visual analog scale, symptom measures, as well as multi-item, multi-domain questionnaires, measuring aspects of health-related quality of life, that's HRQOL. A PRO can be measured by self-report or by an interview, provided that the interviewer records only the patient's response. Symptoms and unobservable concepts known only to the patient, such as pain, intensity, and anxiety level, can be measured using PRO instruments. A PRO instrument can be used in clinical studies to measure the effects of a medical intervention or changes in the health status of a patient. FDA has produced several resources to assist the sponsor in selecting, modifying, or developing a PRO instrument. These include the guidance entitled Patient-Reported Outcome Measures, Use in Medical Product Development to Support Labeling Claims, the series of guidance documents and other resources related to patient-focused drug development, and the following resources that were posted to FDA's website as part of CDRH's 2016 to 2017 strategic priorities. Here are a number of resources. that FDA has provided. And for the last decade or so, FDA has been doing a lot of work in this area, putting out white papers and really pushing for advancement in patient preference and patient-reported outcomes. So if we come down here to the next section, FDA continues that in addition, PRO instruments have been qualified under the Medical Device Development Tools, or MDDT program, as tools that medical device sponsors can use in the development and evaluation of medical devices. Qualification under the MDDT program means CDRH has evaluated the tool and concurs with available supporting evidence that the tool produces scientifically plausible measurements and works as intended within the specified context of use. With the development of novel technologies and novel uses for existing technologies, it is important that outcomes important to patients are measured and included in medical device submissions when appropriate. In addition to providing evidence to assess the safety and/or effectiveness of medical devices, PRO instruments can measure the impact of medical devices on patient well-being and other concepts that may influence healthcare providers and patients when making decisions about potential treatments or management options. FDA believes that information from well-defined and reliable PRO instruments can provide valuable evidence for benefit-risk assessments and can be used in medical device labeling to communicate the effect of a treatment on patient symptoms, functioning, or HRQOL, when the use is consistent with the PRO instrument's documented and supported measurement properties. The agency recognizes there are many ways PRO instruments can be used within clinical studies. For example, PRO instruments may be used to help determine a patient's eligibility for inclusion within a study, to measure primary or secondary safety and/or effectiveness endpoints, either as a standalone or as a component of a composite endpoint. When data from a PRO instrument is used in the evaluation of a medical device, FDA determines the validity evidence needed to support its specified use for a regulatory purpose. FDA uses the term fit for purpose to describe this flexible approach. The objectives of this guidance are to, and the objectives of this video are for you to take away, principles that may be considered when using PRO instruments, recommendations about the importance of ensuring the PRO instruments are fit for purpose, and third, outline best practices to help ensure relevant, reliable, and sufficiently robust PRO instruments are developed, modified, or adapted using the least burdensome approach. And FDA's guidance documents, including this draft guidance, FDA continues, do not establish legally enforceable responsibilities. A lot of this is the same sort of normal boilerplate. Here, FDA says the use of the word should in agency guidance means that something is suggested or recommended but not required. I know FDA doesn't use stronger language than that, but if FDA says should, for all that this is their front matter sort of boilerplate language, I would suggest you should, in plain English, do what FDA tells you you should do. If possible, it's probably going to go better. Here, if we get into scope, FDA intends the principles outlined in this guidance to apply to PRO instruments used in medical device evaluation across the total product lifecycle. This guidance is intended to supplement the aforementioned resources by outlining recommended best practices for developing relevant, reliable, and sufficiently robust PRO instruments using the least burdensome approach. This guidance document does not detail the methods and steps of developing, modifying, or adapting a PRO instrument. Instead, it communicates what FDA believes are some of the best practices for selecting, developing, and modifying PRO instruments for use in medical device evaluation. A glossary is also included as an appendix to clarify terminology. So here next, the general considerations for PRO instrument use in medical device evaluation. FDA lays out some key principles here. 1, establish and define the concept of interest, or COI, the PRO instrument is intended to capture. Clearly identify the role of the PRO, primary, secondary, or exploratory, in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan. Provide evidence showing that the PRO instrument reliably assesses the concept of interest, and effectively and appropriately communicate the PRO-related results in the labeling to inform healthcare provider and patient decision-making. Importance of ensuring PRO instruments are fit for purpose. The PRO instruments that are fit for purpose should be used for a specific context of use, or COU. FDA believes 3 factors should be considered when selecting a PRO instrument, and that is the concept being measured by the PRO instrument meaningful to patients, and would a change in the concept of interest be meaningful to patients? What role will the PRO instrument serve in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan? And 3, does the evidence support its use in measuring the concept of interest as specified in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan? FDA continues that a key consideration when assessing whether a PRO instrument is fit for purpose for a particular COU is the population in which the validity evidence was generated. The population in which the validation work was performed should be consistent with the intended use population in the clinical study protocol. By assessing the similarities and differences between the population in the clinical study and in the development of the PRO instrument, the FDA can determine whether the PRO instrument is fit for purpose. For example, patients with late-stage disease may have different symptoms or perspectives than patients in the early stage. Hence, the items in the PRO instrument developed in early-stage patients may not be applicable to patients experiencing later stages of the disease. On here, FDA lays out best practices for least burdensome selection, development, modification, and adaptation of patient-reported outcome instruments. And they start with a focus on measuring concepts important to patients. One purpose of using PRO instruments should be to assess outcomes that matter to patients. However, not all PRO instruments used in clinical studies accomplish this goal. Incorporating outcomes that reflect patient priorities in the clinical study protocol can help to seamlessly integrate factors included in a patient's decision-making process into FDA's benefit-risk determinations. Assessing outcomes that patients find meaningful may reduce the collection of less important PROs, thereby limiting the unnecessary burden on patients. Ultimately, including outcomes of importance to patients appropriately in the medical device labeling may help inform patients and healthcare provider conversations about treatment or management options. During PRO instrument development, effective engagement, concept elicitation, interviews, and cognitive interviews with patients can help ensure that COIs intended to be measured by a PRO instrument are important to the daily lived experience of patients and could be useful to inform their future decisions regarding the use of the medical device. Concept elicitation interviews identify or confirm the concepts measured by the PRO instrument, as well as what aspects of the concept are most important to the patients, such as the frequency, severity, and/or interference with daily life. For example, pain is a concept, and the aspects that may be most important to patients are its severity and how it interferes with daily life. Next, FDA writes, ensure patient-reported outcome instruments are understandable to patients. The elements of a PRO instrument include the instructions, items, recall period, and response options. FDA recommends that these elements be composed using plain language to help ensure that patients with varying levels of overall literacy and health literacy understand and are able to provide informed responses. In addition, using appropriate benchmarks, such as a point of reference against which things may be compared or assessed, activities or symptoms, wording may facilitate patients being able to accurately report their health status. For example, a sponsor may be interested in assessing visual function. The concept may be measured with items assessing difficulties patients have with activities they may do in everyday life, such as reading books, menus, and labels on medicine bottles. I find it interesting that FDA considers that to be sort of an everyday activity. Important, yes, but I don't read labels on medicine bottles every day. FDA recommends conducting cognitive interviews to generate evidence supporting the wording of these elements. The response options to the items should be consistent with the wording of the item. For example, if the frequency of itching was identified through the concept elicitation interviews as important, then the response option should be measures of frequency, such as never, rarely, sometimes, often, always, and the wording for the response options and items confirmed using cognitive interviews. These interviews should be conducted prior to using a PRO instrument to collect outcomes in a clinical study. Technologies such as tele or video conferencing may facilitate conducting cognitive interviews, allowing diverse patient feedback on the interpretation of the PRO instrument elements. FDA encourages sponsor interactions through the voluntary Q submission program, and FDA is here to help. FDA recommends that you consider offering PRO instruments in different languages where appropriate, and believes that collecting PRO data from all patients, including those with limited English language proficiency and health literacy, can help ensure that the clinical study findings are generalizable to the intended use population. Moreover, adequate patient interpretation of the questionnaire items may help minimize missing data, improve the consistency of item interpretation, and potentially improve the data collected in the clinical study. FDA also wants you to be clear about the role of the PRO instrument in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan. FDA determines the strength of evidence needed to support the measurement properties of a PRO instrument based on the role of the instrument specified in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan. For example, a PRO instrument used to measure a secondary effectiveness endpoint may need different validity evidence than a PRO instrument used to descriptively assess a safety endpoint. FDA believes COI and COU in which a PRO instrument is used should be clearly conveyed in the clinical study protocol and the statistical analysis plan. It's a bit of alphabet soup here, so hopefully you followed all those acronyms. As such, FDA recommends that the COI be clearly defined by a statement of what is being measured, how it is being measured and interpreted, and how the results will be communicated in the labeling. Similarly, FDA recommends that the COU describe the specific role of the PRO instrument in the medical device development and evaluation process, which includes defining what endpoint the PRO instrument is being used to capture in the clinical study, and the amount of change measured by the PRO instrument that is clinically meaningful. The sponsor should plainly state and clearly identify the PRO instrument's COU in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan. During the study design stage prior to the investigational device exemption or IDE submission or conducting of the pivotal study, sponsors are encouraged to engage FDA regarding the relevance and suitability of a proposed PRO instrument to the benefit risk assessment. And again, they call out the pre-submission process. When presenting results from a clinical study, which includes a PRO instrument, in a medical device submission, the sponsor should confirm that the concept measured by the PRO instrument matches the COI stated in the COU and that the specified change in the PRO instrument is clinically meaningful. Sponsors may want to consider clearly identifying the location of this information within the application. It seems that FDA generally might expect this more in PMAs based on the language that they used here. And then leverage existing PRO instruments and validity evidence. Sponsors often choose to select from existing PRO instruments rather than develop a new PRO instrument. Existing PRO instruments can be used as is, modified, or adapted, which is often less resource intensive than creating a new PRO instrument, due to the ability to leverage existing validity evidence. Modifying or adapting an existing PRO instrument may be a least burdensome approach for a new COU. FDA encourages the modification or adaptation of existing PRO instruments where it is feasible, and such an approach would still result in a relevant and reliable PRO instrument for the COU. FDA recommends reviewing peer-reviewed literature, a bit of a double review there, as a starting point for identifying the validity evidence associated with the development, use, or evaluation of the PRO instrument of interest, while keeping in mind that PRO instruments should reflect contemporary activities of daily life. Accordingly, PRO instruments historically used to assess patient functioning may not adequately reflect functioning in the present due to technological advances that may facilitate the performance of certain tasks. Modification of the items may be needed to ensure a given COI is still adequately being measured. To modify the PRO instrument, the sponsor may conduct supplementary cognitive interviews and construct new items as needed to adequately capture the concept of interest. Sponsors are encouraged to engage in discussion with FDA through, again, the pre-submission process. And then FDA calls out, consider alternative platforms in parallel development for generating validity evidence for PRO instruments. Real-world evidence derived from multiple sources outside of the clinical research setting may be used to generate validity evidence for PRO instruments. With the proliferation of real-world data, or RWD, it is possible that PRO instrument development could be nested, pun I think intended in terms of the nest system, in a RWD source. Professional organization and patient-driven registries may also help identify patients and facilitate generation of validity evidence. FDA encourages sponsors to consider these alternative approaches to generate validity evidence for PRO instruments as potential less burdensome approaches. Not least burdensome approaches, less burdensome approaches. Sponsors proactively developing or modifying PRO instruments for use in future product development may want to also consider using early feasibility, phase clinical studies, pivotal clinical studies, and/or post-approval studies to generate quantitative validity evidence. Such an approach of using the parallel development work may be more efficient and cost-effective than conducting a sequential, separate PRO instrument validation study. When choosing this option, sponsors should prospectively specify in the clinical study protocol and statistical analysis plan the intent to generate quantitative validity evidence for the PRO instrument. Sponsors should note that generating validity evidence as part of the pivotal clinical study does not mean the PRO instrument can be used to support specific statements regarding safety and/or effectiveness in the pivotal study, in the labeling or public summaries. Instead, the validity evidence may support the PRO instrument's use in future clinical studies, including post-market studies. Now, I think that might depend on how you structure it. So it'll be curious to see how this develops. Because if you use the PRO to generate quantitative validity evidence, but that validity evidence isn't valid, it seems a bit problematic. So we'll see how that develops. Collaborate with others in the pre-competitive space is the next point FDA wants you to take away from this guidance. Where possible and appropriate, the FDA encourages sponsors and other stakeholders to work together in the pre-competitive space to develop, modify, or adapt a PRO instrument for use in regulatory submissions. Sponsors are encouraged to consider relevant stakeholders for potential collaborations, including but not limited to patient organizations, health professional organizations, and research institutions with expertise in PRO instrument development. Collaborative development of a PRO instrument may also engender broader acceptance of results due to fewer concerns about bias in assessing the relevant aspects of the condition or its treatment or management of patients. Sponsors should consider submitting PRO instruments for qualification under the MDDP program. So then we get into the summary here. And FDA finishes by saying, to further integrate patient voices through the total product lifecycle of medical devices, it is important to consider concepts important to patients in the regulatory evaluation and surveillance of medical devices. Well-designed PRO instruments facilitate incorporating patient perspectives as scientific evidence to support regulatory and healthcare decision-making. FDA believes that the recommendations outlined in this guidance will help ensure that PRO instruments are developed, modified, adapted, or used in the evaluation of medical devices in a way that generates relevant, reliable, and sufficiently robust data to assess outcomes of importance to patients, regulators, and healthcare providers. This guidance outlines flexible approaches to developing, modifying, or adapting a PRO instrument. FDA encourages sponsors and other stakeholders to explore other least burdensome approaches and discuss those approaches with FDA to help determine whether or how they can be applied to support regulatory submissions. And then we have a glossary of terms, and that fairly well wraps up today's guidance document. And the objectives for today's discussion are the ability to describe principles that may be considered when using PRO instruments in the evaluation of medical devices, 1. Second, provide recommendations about the importance of ensuring the PRO instruments are fit for purpose. And 3, outline best practices to help ensure relevant, reliable, and sufficiently robust PRO instruments are developed, modified, or adapted using the least burdensome approach. I really want to thank you for joining me today. Hopefully you found today's discussion interesting and useful, and really look forward to catching you in the next one. Like, subscribe, and see you again soon. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.